Thank you. Okay, can you hear me on, okay, you can hear me on this one, all right. Okay. All right, I'm gonna get started. Okay, so when did space fandom truly begin? Since humankind has been able to gaze at the moon, the sun, the planets, and other celestial bodies in the sky, we have been hungry to find out more about what is out there. It can be argued that space fandom probably began the moment our ancient ancestors looked out into the night sky and discovered pinpoints of light, some large, some bright, some distant, some faint, some static, and some moving. They probably wondered, as much as we still do, what lurks out there. Now, the classic movie, the classic 1968 movie, 2001, A Space Odyssey, written by Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke, touches upon this theme. When the film was first released, people were baffled by its beginnings. It depicted primates being visited by a mysterious otherworldly monolith. There's no dialogue for the first 30 minutes of the film, save for primitive grunting. But Kubrick and Clarke were trying to make a link between what fascinated early humans and what fascinates modern humans. When a hominid throws a bone into the sky, it functions as sort of an aerial or a signal, giving a message, and transforms into a spaceship. This hunger led to the development of processes to better understand the universe we live in. This curiosity led to advances in astronomy throughout the centuries before rockets to space were even developed. Those who didn't gaze at the skies through sometimes rudimentary telescopes still dreamed about reaching the heavens. The Chinese developed primitive rockets that would later influence rocket pioneers, and astronomers, including but not limited to Galileo, who's right down there, would use increasingly more sophisticated telescopes to make discoveries about our solar system, its moons, our galaxy, and other galactic neighbors. By the mid-1800s, artists and writers had begun illustrating and writing elaborate science fiction stories about space travel. A notable early example involved Jules Verne's From the Earth to the Moon, not to be confused with the television miniseries based on the Andrew Chaikin book, A Man on the Moon. The Verne tale would prove to be eerily prophetic. From the Earth to the Moon tells the story about the development and launch of a capsule-shaped projectile containing 3 men racing toward the moon. A space gun used to launch the vehicle, called the Columbiad, was based in Tampa, Florida. A little over a century later, a ship called Columbia, containing 3 men, would launch around 140 miles from Tampa, Florida, and would rendezvous with the ship called the Eagle. And these 3 men would make their own journey to the moon. Authors and artists fascinated with space would produce more elaborate science fiction stories. A popular series involving a protagonist named John Carter was written by Edgar Rice Burroughs, starting in 1911. This series would later be name-checked as an influence in a BBC interview, I think in 1982, by astronaut John Young, who himself was no slouch in visiting other worlds, as we know. Magazines including Amazing Science Fiction and Astounding Stories of Super Science would fire readers' imaginations. The golden age of science fiction. I knew you all would laugh at this one. The golden age of science fiction is considered to span from 1938 to 1946, but in reality, this era lasted throughout the 1950s. Artists such as Frank Kelly Freas, who later would create the Skylab 2 mission patch, and Tim Gagnon in his talk touched on that, would produce covers for science fiction magazines and pulp novels, attracting the reader with far-out, vivid visions of other worlds and, as we can see, often scantily clad women. Over a 15-year period, starting in 1947, humankind accomplished feats that no one thought could ever be accomplished. Breaking the sound barrier was just the beginning. Okay, so we have 1947, Chuck Yeager breaks the sound barrier in the Bell X-1. In 1953, Hillary and Norgay reached the summit of Mount Everest. In 1956, Don Larson of the New York Yankees throws a perfect game, which I believe was the only one in World Series history. 1957, Sputnik launches. In 1958, Explorer 1 launches from Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, which solidified our entry into the US space race. In 1961, Gagarin orbits Earth, and that is the first human-helmed orbital space flight. This period, which was topped off by the first US orbital Mercury space flight flown by John Glenn in 1962, show that people love to hear, see, and read about other people doing extraordinary things. That, I think, is the essence of fandom. Mid-1950s, the conquest of spaceflight began to become more popularized. Articles written by Wernher von Braun, one of America's preeminent rocket scientists, and other notable spaceflight authors were published in Collier's magazine starting in 1952 with a title that functioned almost as a command: "Man will conquer space soon." Von Braun became a celebrity because of these articles and his related work on television with Walt Disney. Love him or hate him, he was one of our nation's top space advocates at the time and fired the imaginations of a public looking for the next big thing, which happened to be space and the moon. By 1957, the real space race between the United States and the Soviet Union was heating up, and were magazines of the time selling it? You bet they were. Mid-century advertisements spoke of a new world in which new materials and brand new electronics would make the future a thing of the present, often showing spacemen as a symbol of a space-age switched-on future. The advertisement by Sylvania Electronics on the right harkens to another popular theme of that era, the atom, which was meant to show power and might. Americans began to become sold on the idea of this space-age future, and they couldn't get enough of it. America became space gaga. There's a book called We Could Not Fail, and it touches on how the allure of space thoroughly seized American pop culture. The space program began to develop its own entertainment. Songs, movies, comedians, television programs all found a way to connect themselves to NASA. Copies of magazines, including Time and Life. As you all probably know, Life had a deal with the first US astronauts to cover their lives and their missions, and readers soaked up stories about their new space heroes, even though the stories were often puff pieces and were heavily coded in public relations speak. The first 7 Mercury astronauts, who were previously unheard of military pilots, became celebrities. Their fans chose sides and treated them like the Beatles. Are you a Gus girl or are you a Deke girl? Among space fans, I heard you, Lois. I heard that. Among space fans, favoring certain astronauts is a theme that remains to this day. Now, space fandom and how space was covered during that time did have its limitations. There were, albeit not in very large numbers, women and African Americans who worked at NASA or NASA contractors, and there were certainly women and African American fans of spaceflight. But these groups, which were considered minorities, were considered exceptions and not something that could become a rule. Now, do y'all remember the scantily clad ladies on the covers of the science fiction pulp novels? They were merely accessories for men's adventures in those stories. I hate to point that out. African American milestones in space were generally only covered by the black press at that time, unfortunately. In addition, there were other nations besides the US and the Soviet Union with interests in space, but these nations' programs were little discussed. For example, the European spaceflight endeavors merited merely a couple sentences in the 1967 World Book Yearbook. Because of these factors, the spaceflight community couldn't fully give itself its own narrative about its interests and experiences. But by the 1970s, though, the community was getting warmer. Sub-communities, including the L5 Society, the National Space Institute, and science fiction fan groups popped up. becoming magnets for attracting enthusiasts and professionals from all walks of life. These groups, and later the Planetary Society, also sometimes acted politically for space, encouraging its members to contact their local representatives and advocate for space-related causes. By 1987, the L5 Society and the National Space Institute merged to form what is now known as the National Space Society, or the NSS. And this next slide, we're going to need some mood music for it. Let's see. Oh, this one. Okay, this is something good. All right, a related sidebar. Let me turn it down a bit. All right, it's 1975 right now. I found this in an Atlas Obscura article, and I wanted to share this. I thought this was so funny. Here's a neat artifact from the NSS's early days when it was still the National Space Institute. And this is part of a breakfast menu devised to celebrate the launch of July 1975's Apollo-Soyuz mission. And as you can see, it's 1975, so people were definitely still drinking in the mornings. Here you go, you see the vodka cola here, in which East truly meets West. And also note at the bottom how they tried to make the menu healthy. They followed the vodka cola with a nice innocuous fruit cup so nobody caught scurvy. So, okay, that's the end of this sidebar. All right. But I digress. Let me go to the next slide. But I digress. Of course, other avenues for space-crazed fans, especially this one, included spaceflight books, which have proven to be the gateway drugs into space fandom. Months ago, I asked members of Space Hipsters to name the books that spurred their enthusiasm for the subject, and I received hundreds of different answers, too many to put in this talk. Some named the Time Life Man in Space series, some named the Jane Spaceflights directories, some named the earlier science fiction works I discussed in the talk. But at any rate, all these different titles have brought us to the same place. By the 1980s, space fandom began to go electronic, as fans dialed in either by phone or dial-up modem to get news and information. Usenet forums often filled in enthusiasts on the news of the day. I recall one member of Space Hipsters relating he learned of the Challenger accident through a Usenet forum as far back as the morning of January 28, 1986. Other avenues included, but are not limited to, the ones listed here. I mentioned the Usenet groups. There were CompuServe groups, especially the Florida Today Space section, Yahoo groups, NASAspaceflight.com. If you had money, the NSS had a 1-900 number. If you didn't mind, paying that phone bill on your parent, explain that to your mom and dad. You had amateur ham radio and slow scan TV groups. The BIS had its own phone number, the Space Line. There are space modeling groups, and of course, I would be remiss, Robert Perlman's Collect Space, which is a wonderful resource, and I believe it started in 1999, and it is still in effect. So, how does this all lead to Space Hipsters? Over time, fans, enthusiasts, advocates, writers, artists, historians, professionals, and people from all walks of life wanted to and deserved to share their own narratives about spaceflight, its history, and diverse figures. Space Hipsters was founded in part to allow this, but of course, the group didn't necessarily start in that spirit, and some strange twists and turns happen along the way, which I'll discuss. A piece by Gary Schroeder called The Ethnography of Online Communities discusses how social media communities are characterized by 7 distinct elements: a creation story, a creed, icons, rituals, sacred words or lexicons, non-believers, and a leader. Space Hipsters, which today provides a narrative for the spaceflight community covering past and present happenings, began as a place to share my stupid spaceflight memes. Really, But I guess I'll start with my introduction to spaceflight since I'm the leader of the group. Okay, thus begins the most excruciating part of this talk, and for me at least. I hate talking about myself. I was born in Clearwater, Florida in 1978, and I was raised in Central Florida against the backdrop of the early space shuttle program. And as you can tell by this 1985 photo, I was bitten by the space bug pretty early in life. This is me at age 7 at the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex. The transformative experience for me was the launch of STS-2 in 1981, November 1981. STS-2 was the first launch I viewed. I was 3 years old, and I lived about 140 miles from Kennedy Space Center. I do remember the space shuttle was brand new at the time, and I was familiar with it, and I knew what it was, but when STS-1 happened, I was still blissfully ignorant about all matters spaceflight related. That fateful November morning, my mom took me outside, and we looked toward the east, and I saw a pinpoint trailed by orange flames leaping from the sky. About 2 minutes later, 2 tiny matchsticks dropped off the pinpoint, and what appeared to be a bluish flame came out of the pinpoint. I did not yet know this, but the 2 men on top of that pinpoint were General Joe Engle and Admiral Richard Truly. The dot continued to curve upward, and it disappeared. From that moment on, I was obsessed. I couldn't get enough of the space shuttle. I was amazed that I'd actually seen people go to space. So, as you can imagine, I acted like a total idiot when I met General Joe Engle 35 years to the day of STS-2's launch. This was 35 years later. So, okay. I also remember STS-3's launch, which took place in March 1982. By this point, I considered myself a salty space veteran expert at the age of 4. The mission was helmed by Marine Colonel Jack Lausma and U.S. Air Force Colonel Gordon Fullerton. I did not yet know that one day I would meet that mission's gracious, friendly commander, and he would become the subject of a meme that would directly impact my life. But more on that later. Okay. I am going to skip over a lot of time to expedite this talk, but tons of stuff happened between 1982 and 2010, including 6 years in the United States Navy. But by 2010, I was a 32-year-old struggling freelance writer living in St. Petersburg, Florida. To make ends meet, while I tried and often failed to sell stories I'd written, I was working at a local department store as a perfume girl. Between spritzing samples of Yves Saint Laurent's Paris on grumpy people, I became aware that spaceflight was pretty big on social media. NASA had in fact started inviting regular civilians to launches and events via NASA tweet-ups, which were later called NASA socials. I was still pretty big into space in a big way at that point. So I started following a lot of amazing space blogs on Tumblr, including Laura Owensby's Light This Candle, which showcases a lot of rare photos from the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo era. In late 2010, I decided to start my own blog called This Space Available. I'm just warning you, if you actually go back and read the first post, it was not very good at the beginning. Thankfully, it has improved over time and is still active at present time. Okay. So, in February 2011, I was thinking about putting together a group on Facebook so I could share my often terrible, sacrilegious space memes. And on February 15th that year, I asked my husband, Stephen Carney, what it should be called. And he retorted, "Why don't you just call it Space Hipsters since you think you did everything first?" And I was like, okay. So I figured if I grew to dislike that name, I could always change it later. And besides, we only had about 4 people in the group at that time, so it's not like many people would find out about it, right? Here's me and Steve at the SpaceX CRS-1 NASA social in late 2012, and he was one of the first space hipsters. And I do have to say, on a very serious note, he's been tremendously supportive through this whole odyssey. He's actually been a big influence, so he's a great person. So we started with 4 members as follows. Our first members were me, my sister Amy, she's a real nice lady, a friend of mine, we're still pretty good friends, my husband, who actually did not want to join the group because he's a baseball guy, so in his defense, I wouldn't want to join a baseball group. So as of writing this presentation, Space Hipsters now totals over 14,900 members. The name I was divided about stuck. We now number 8 moderators, including Laura of Light This Candle, Lois Honeycutt, Chris Boyd, Burke Burnett, Sam Mundell, Rodri Van Click, and Tina Stagg, who are all from different time zones from all over the world. In the first 3 years, we developed guidelines to keep the group in good working order. A great graphic designer named Brian Matney came up with our logo around this time. And in 2014, I believe, Lois came up with the idea to have merchandise so our growing fan base would have something to identify with and something to wear. And this began the era of the ubiquitous blue pen that would appear on the lapels of many a space fan, author, artist, and sometimes even astronauts, cosmonauts, and space travelers. Now, in early 2016, during our 5th anniversary, one night I was just chilling on my couch, browsing Facebook casually when this photo popped up. And I thought this was a Photoshop. It was not. Somehow, Space Hipsters made it to actual space. I'll never fly to space in my lifetime, probably, but this was definitely the next best thing. Seeing this and also seeing personalities such as, including but not limited to Alexei Leonov, if you remember, he was the first person to walk in space, wearing our pin has been a thrill beyond compare. Now remember, the group started so I could share my memes, which usually consisted of some awful imagined situation presented in caption form alongside a NASA photo of classic astronauts. But while these caught on, the group changed in ways that I couldn't even predict. People began to share their memories of, you get it. I can't say that word too good. Of the golden era of spaceflight, which were often very moving. Sometimes family members of key spaceflight players would share their memories, which was and continues to be seriously a huge honor. Space Hipsters began to grow merely from silly memes to branching into space history preservation and space advocacy. And in the last 3 years, thanks to Lois, who is a tireless organizer, we have had 3 official meetups. Space Enthusiast, thank you, give her a hand. Space enthusiasts from all backgrounds have enjoyed tours of historic space sites. These tours have not only exposed fans to a lot of history, but also have connected enthusiasts. And this year, we awarded the inaugural Space Hipsters Book Prize, celebrating excellence in spaceflight literacy, a cause near and dear to our hearts. This year's winner was astronaut Scott Kelly's book, Endurance, by the way. In addition, we have donated to numerous causes, including but not limited to sending Native American girls to space camp and helping with, helping with Hurricane Matthew recovery efforts. We began to look outside of ourselves and outside of memes into the community. This next slide is a really good one. I want you all to take a picture of it. Another cause near and dear to me as a spaceflight chronicler was making sure content in the group was legitimate and accurate, and I think it's safe to say my fellow moderators feel the same way. By the way, there was no mutiny on Skylab, just so y'all know. In all seriousness, we began to take a look at what was shared in the group to make sure it told the story of spaceflight in an accurate and a tasteful way. So, okay, this is where the talk really gets stupid, so I'm about to apologize. All right, around 2015, things started to get really weird in my life, and it started with the story of Buran. Actually, more like the story of Buran being shared over 100+ times in the group in a matter of days. During that time, my blood pressure is going up just thinking about this. During that time, a bored panda story, which there's a screenshot of the actual story shown there, began making the rounds multiple times, depicting the plight of poor Soviet-era space shuttles rotting away in an abandoned warehouse in Kazakhstan. I politely told members to stop sharing this piece, as we'd seen it literally hundreds of times, and things erupted from there. I became a meme, a living meme, and I was inextricably linked with Buran forever. Since 2015, I have become the mostly willing subject of tons of Buran memes, and I have somehow amassed the largest collection of Buran memorabilia that I'm sure anyone owns in this universe. The following slides include just a few of the memes involving the Soviet Union's doomed space shuttle. And we got a couple ones here. That's I'm going to go to the next slide. At one point, an Apollo-era astronaut who shall remain nameless, but if you ask me, I'll tell you who it is, remain nameless, weighed in on the group's Buran controversy, relating that he'd actually sat inside a Buran at one point and had gotten a good look at it. He used very strong language concerning the Soviet shuttle's design, and I will leave it at that. Today, the group, I'm not going to repeat what he said here. Today, the group has embraced its own meme, and we actually celebrate the day of Buran's first and only unmanned spaceflight, which marks its 30th year in November. Okay. Okay, also remember the sweet commander of STS-3 with the apple pie cheeks, and you know, he's all about the Marines and stuff like that. Oops, sorry. One day, he also became an inadvertent meme, and let me tell you the story of how this happened. One day, one of our less chemically sober members in the group started posting random photos of the STS-3 crew and identified its commander as Robert Lausma. And being a total smartass, I messaged one of the moderators with, "That Bobby Lausma is something, isn't he?" That started a conversation, a back and forth about how nice and friendly Jack Lausma was, how nobody had ever seen him in a bad mood, and what if one fateful day someone got on his last nerve and Jack said, "To heck with it," and developed an attitude. Thus, we invented an alter ego for Jack Lausma, Bad Bobby Lausma. I was at work. I quickly photoshopped an eye patch on a 1971 photo of the sweet Colonel Lausma to make him look bad, and things got a little carried away from there. So, all right. Bad Bobby became the subject of a still ongoing series of pulp novel covers by Al Petrie, and even made it into a movie poster by Brian Matney. His outrageous, highly fictionalized adventures have gained their own fans. And my favorite one, that's on the right, is my favorite one. That is his dual RTLS with Joe Engel. So, which of course, you know, really happened, you know. Jack / Bad Bobby were even immortalized in a limited edition Lego set designed by Chris Spain. Yes, that is Jack in the infamous Skylab shower, and if you turn his head, he turns into Bad Bobby with a sneer and an eye patch. And somehow, I am part of this Lego set too. In case you were wondering, yes, Jack Lousma is aware of his evil twin, and I just want to say he and his family are wonderful people and they're very good sports. So, seriously, they're great people for being understanding about all this mess. So. All right, yet another meme or trope involves the facilities verification Saturn V vehicle, or the SA-500F, which never flew but has appeared in toy and movie form more than any other version of the Saturn V. The 500F has flown in Space Hipsters more time than it ever did in real life, and still makes cameo appearances, mainly thanks to John Duncan, who I'm calling out right now, who runs the ApolloSaturn.com website. Here's a particularly nasty, ugly, emotionally traumatizing version of the 500F that John once posted, which I like to call the Sky 100F. So that's pretty horrible. So in conclusion, I just want to say Space Hipsters is not the only space fandom group online and on Facebook. There are tons of great groups on Facebook alone, including one dedicated to Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. There's a space history group, there's a shuttle group, and there's a Skylab group. And I think they're all fantastic. I think it's safe to say that all influences on and from ye old space fandom influence Space Hipsters and other enthusiast groups. These influences include Discovery Learning, science fiction, nostalgia, memories of the space race's beginnings, and space advocacy. While we still have, I think, some way to go in better representing diversity in spaceflight, as space fandom matured throughout the decades, minority groups began to be better represented, and the space community was able to better represent and narrativize itself. And to all the people all over the world who have stuck with us throughout the years, I thank you, and I'm forever grateful for your support. I hope you keep coming back, and I never imagined in my lifetime any of this would happen. Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, good. I have like one. Yeah, tell people that know if they can get them. Huh? Do you want questions? Does anybody have any questions? I see some of you are leaving. If anyone has questions, we have a little bit of time. So, I also wanted to say, while some of the individuals here were running out of hipster pins, there are some at the Nova Space booth. I think they have around 50, so I wanted to put that out there. Yes. I'll have to kill you if I tell you. I can't. I really can't. I'll tell you in private. Yeah, it just honestly, I had no idea how it ended up there myself until recently. But I'll tell you in private, we didn't really jockey to get it up there. It just was one of those things that just kind of ended up there, and I honestly had no idea. But I do have it back. I did receive it back in the mail. That was the craziest package I've ever gotten. So, any other questions, remarks, anything? Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Have a great day. Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it.